And HE as well.
Yeah, and HE, yeah, definitely, yeah. Okay, so one of the things I'm struggling to do this semester is to make sense of all the different career learning frameworks that there are out there. There seem to be a dozen I can name, and there are probably, dozens more out there that I haven't come across. And when I look at them all, sometimes they look the same, and I don't really understand what's different about one to the next one, and other times they look so very different that I can't see a sort of common thread. So you, of course, came up with the DOTS model, which is still the definitive model, and I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about, I suppose perhaps how your thinking has evolved in terms of the framework since then.
Yeah, I mean, the DOTS model, it's been durable for sure. I don't know, it's dominant, but I think it's still there. People still find it extremely useful. I mean, Bill and I developed it when we were doing actually a very interesting piece of work on schools, and it just seemed to us to be a coherent, parsimonious. I think parsimony really matters with these frameworks. I think frameworks which are durable tend to be fairly sort of, they're memorable, and if you have something which is there's only 4 things in it, and there's an acronym, even if it's the wrong way round.
Yeah.
DOTS is not the way. SODIT is actually the right way round, but we don't seem to use that one. And actually, I think if you look at most of the other frameworks, those 4 elements are there. They need to be there. Actually, if you miss any of them out, when you think about it, you think, oh well, that doesn't make sense. So as a kind of core, I still think it works. Now, of course, Bill has developed it with his new DOTS frame, which I think is extremely useful, and added another dimension, which is more process-oriented. And there's all sorts of things you can do, and other frameworks do. They explore some of those things. So I still think it's a useful core, but it's not sufficient for sure, and there's a lot more that needs to be addressed and said, which is where some of the other frameworks have been, I think, very helpful in terms of doing that.
So what advice would you give to practitioners for how they use these frameworks? You might read, 6 or 7 of them and think, well, that one works for me and that one doesn't. I
think it's good to interrogate them, a range of them, and then you find one that works for you in your context. And I think some of these are context, work more, some contexts will work better than others. But also I think you need a framework, because you need to have something which shapes and models what you're trying to do, and is a kind of almost a check as to whether you miss things and that kind of thing. So whether you develop your own framework or draw upon one framework or adopt some mix, I mean, I think there's a variety of ways in which it can be done. But I think there must be a framework, and there are a variety of resources to draw from. And I think it's for each individual to work out what works for them as a person and in the context that they are, and makes intellectual sense, but also feels operable.
Yeah. So you're talking there about the idea of context, and an awful lot of these career learning frameworks were developed within the school context. Yeah. And some of my students will be working in that context, but others will be working in higher education and with adult career changes or the unemployed, or a range of contexts. So what do you think about how the frameworks apply to different contexts?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, actually, higher education, to focus on that just for a moment, I actually been involved with quite a lot right from the beginning. In fact, very early on, quite soon after we developed the DOTS framework, I did a paper in the British Journal of Guidance and Counselling. It was on career education and higher education. It really adapted the DOTS model and looked at what was at that time going on, which was still pretty early days. There were a number of things which we found, and I just looked at them in terms of the DOTS model, and it worked as a way of analysing what they were doing. It was actually quite useful, but that was also a way in which I think there was quite a useful paper in terms of promoting the concept, and quite a lot of people started to get quite interested in that in higher education. And of course that's been greatly extended because of the concern with employability and enterprise. And these are 2 big programmatic initiatives in higher education with quite a lot of leverage behind them, some of which is political, some of which is more conceptual. But it's always seemed to me that these are complementary concepts. Employability is complementary to enterprise. employability at its core is how to be employable by somebody else or some other organisation, and enterprise is about how to set up something of your own. They actually interweave, because if you talk about intrapreneurship, that's within enterprises, sorry, within organisations, and actually we say enterprises, we use that word. So they do interweave themselves, but what career development learning, and that's the term which I think is being used more in higher education rather than career education now, I mean the terminology varies, but career development learning is used quite a bit. I quite like it. What it does is to interweave those, but ground them in the individual's own development, and in terms of sustainability and progression, to indicate the importance of that. It's not just about employability is not just being work ready and getting your first job. It is about how to develop sustainable employability on the basis of which you can launch a career, and extend a career, and develop a career. So, and career development learning is absolutely at its heart about that. So, it seems to me that any one of those without the others probably is inadequate. So they are complementary, interweaving, overlapping concepts. But I think the career development learning bit is the bit that sometimes is ignored in some of the dialogues about employability. It's very important that it's there, and that's of course where career services do have a stake, and in most universities they do have a role, sometimes a very significant role, sometimes a lesser role, but it does the whole thing about how you link all this with the wider curriculum, with the role of teaching departments, is a big issue. So I think in a way there's been a lot more interesting things happening in higher education actually than in schools, where there's been this erosion. In higher education, there's a lot of push behind it, but career development learning can sometimes get slightly marginalised. Then there's the much wider issue with adults. Now, if we start to recognise that it's about individuals as well, that almost any career intervention is about career learning. Mm-hmm. That's the reality. If you do some career coaching, intensive career coaching with an individual, actually, what you're doing is helping them to develop their career learning. So to think about that in learning terms makes perfect sense. I think in terms of interventions, I mean, there have been a lot of programmes for unemployed people, for example, which have been about groups. And actually, they tend to be about employability, but the same point stands, which is that if they're not just about getting a quick fix and how to present yourself in an interview and how to develop a CV and so on and so forth, to enable you to get a job, but if it's not about any job, it's about a job that suits you and which you want to commit yourself to and from which you can develop, and to learn how to do that on a developing basis, then we're into career development learning. So it seems to me, again, a very important complement to and part of any programme for unemployed people or people who are in employment but wanting to develop their career. And again, there's a variety of interventions which can take place in enterprises and in organisations and elsewhere, and in adult education as well. So I think the concept actually is applicable to all groups, and third age issues as well. I mean, preparation for what used to be called preparation for retirement. Now increasingly it's about preparation for next stage of transitions. But again, I think there's lots of interventions there, including group interventions, where it needs to be planned in those learning terms, but also recognising the learning aspects of the other interventions you might undertake. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does. I was just going to ask you to talk a little bit more about what you see as the differences between employability and career development learning in terms of what you actually cover.
Right. Well, as I say, employability tends to be thought of as how to develop the skills to be effective in a workplace.
So that's your teamwork and communication skills.
All those kinds of things. And often they tend to be thought of as those generic skills. Yeah. And in higher education context, they are the things which tend to be the kind of hidden curriculum, if you like. You're taught bodies of knowledge. Yeah. But actually, many people never use those bodies of knowledge. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's still the case. Over half of graduate vacancies are for students of any subject. By definition, most of them are not going to be using their subject content. However, what is the benefit they get from their courses is all these transferable skills, that core skills, whatever you want to call them, which they've learned mainly through the processes of learning. Yeah. And they're all those things about group work and autonomy and critical skills and so on, all those things. So those are, I think, when we think about employability, I think that is the core of it. I think enterprise, as I say, is really about how to take initiatives and how to manage that, and how to know how to not to have the motivation towards it, but also the skills you need to do it, and including attitudinal. Career development learning is about the sustainability of those things on a progressive basis throughout life, and how to think about employability and enterprise and how they might interweave. I mean, many people interweave working in a company and being self-employed or whatever in different ways, but how you interweave those things progressively through a career, grounded in your own distinctive interests, values, personality, etc., and your own needs and wishes and aspirations. Employability can phase those things out. It can be about saying, these are things that employers want you to be, so you've got to present yourself and develop yourself so you become the person they want you to be. And career at its heart is about the individual saying, yes, of course I know I've got to do that in order to market myself, in order to get money, whether it's a job or whatever, but actually I want to do something which satisfies me, which fulfills me, where I feel I'm using all my distinctive skills and doing something I think is worthwhile. And so I want to drive this agenda, and I have personal needs and so forth. So career also is about that. It grounds it, all these other things in relation to the individual's own distinctive needs and wishes and aspirations.
So I'm just thinking about how I have my personal experience of seeing employability in practice. And my sense is that it often, I mean, you mentioned this, that it often, the careersy bit of it can get really marginalised. And the focus that I see in universities is so often exclusively on the transition skills. So the curriculum is there to take care of the, teamwork and, cognitive skills and all that kind of stuff. And then the careers input is, let's make sure you've got a good CV and you know how to behave in an interview.
Precisely.
And I wondered what your take on that was.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's where DOTS comes back in, see, because, okay, we've got quite a bit of tea. But what about the rest? So I think that's the trap. Because people can see the need for the CV interview bit. It's fairly obvious and not difficult to sell. But, we'll do that. But get at this other stuff. It actually is about the philosophical basis of what you're doing. And it requires, in a way, a little bit of a shift in mindset. Because now, instead of just thinking about the employer's needs, we now think about the individual's needs, big time. And that may or may not be taken on board. Also, it's a bit more difficult, so it's far more complex.
As a practitioner or as a client?
Well, I think probably both, but I think particularly as a practitioner, I think as a practitioner, the interview CV stuff is relatively technical, actually, and therefore definable and tangible. The others are much broader, they're looser, they're more complex, they're more demanding, they're more interesting, actually, I think. And indeed, to do a proper, actually, you've got to do the CV bit, really. You've got to do quite a lot of the S bit. And you've got to know a bit about the O bit. So, all these things actually are interdependent, I think. But, as I say, I think it is a bigger jump, a more demanding jump, but I would say a necessary jump.
I also see an issue, and I just wonder your view on this, which is that students are very enthusiastic to come along to CV and interview workshops. But if you offer a workshop on, working out what you want to do with your life, students don't turn up. And stakeholders in universities are very keen on, how many bodies have been through the door this year?
Well, that's absolutely right. And again, it's tangibility. And students are very utilitarian. That's the culture. They've been brought up as far as education. Okay, what's it going to do for me, this? So have a pitch up, what's it going to do for me? And okay, there's credits attached to it, fine, because I can see that I'm getting some payback for my efforts. But I might do one or two other things a bit, but I've got to be able to see it, and I've got to know that at the end of this, I'm going to be able to do this, which I couldn't do before, and I need to be able to do that. So that's very utilitarian and very sensible. But the other things, actually, in the end, are more important. Require. You've got to say, I'm prepared to recognise that that I don't really know what I want to do, and I think this might help me with this, and I'm prepared to address what's probably going to be quite complicated work in order to do it. I'm prepared to at least expose myself to that, to come along to something. So you've got to define yourself as being somebody who's inadequate in some way, and as somebody who's prepared to do something about it, and actually to pitch up on the day when you've got plenty of other things you could be doing with your friends. So I can see how. You can build some of those things into the curriculum, but there's issues then about whether you get the right kind of motivation, and also maybe you change the nature of what you're doing in order to make it accessible. So there are all sorts of dilemmas around all of this, I think. And of course that's where the link with the interview bit comes in, because if you are doing some, there's less and less of it in higher education, but if you were doing something on where you were seeing students, at least on an individual basis to some extent, and you started a conversation and it was very clear that they really didn't know, but they really were anxious about it, you could then suggest, why don't you come along to our workshop next week, because this is where we're going to be doing precisely that. And people do pitch up, but not perhaps people who need it most don't, and there's plenty of people who could benefit from it who don't. Yeah. So these are the kind of.
But the CV can be used as a sort of way to get them through the door.
It can be a hook.
And then once you've got them,
that's a very good point. I think it can be a very useful hook, and you can then build something around it, which can then start to get into some other areas, and then maybe you can have something alongside it which kind of builds on those areas more. Yeah. But they can now make sense of it. They've got that bit of confidence in you and in the process, but also in themselves, to be able to take it forward. So I think that's a useful way to see it as a hook.
Okay. So I suppose thinking about the future, what do you think is there? What are the next stages in terms of career development learning, careers education? What should we be thinking about? What's the future?
Well, I think patently technology is transformational in terms, and I think with all career interventions, and I think thinking about how we harness that, and I've always seen it not as a replacement for human interventions, definitely not just simply as a tool, but as an agent of change. We've got to remodel what we do, and of course, actually in terms of employability, for example, Tristan Hooley's done quite a bit of work on this. Actually, online employability skills are really, really important, because a lot of self-presentation and job seeking and so on takes place through the internet now and through social media. So I think that's a really important area in terms of moving forward. I still think we've got to do more work to get better concepts, to be able to articulate them better, because time is limited, in all curricula, and in terms of career interventions, resources are always going to be limited. So how do we manage those effectively? But I think the concept of learning, the more that underpins the way we think about career interventions, whatever they may be, whether it is career coaching or whatever it is, and think about it in learning terms, and develop perhaps stronger models to underpin all of that, the better.
Fantastic.